My mother grew up on a farm and went away and worked her way through teacher's college and then came back home and taught school for 4 years. Then she and my daddy ran away and got married. They ran about 1.5 miles from Crabtree to Fines Creek. He was 43, she was 25. They had neither ever been married before. They stayed for 3 or 4 days before they'd show up again at home. In the next couple of years, my brother and I were born. When we started to school, she decided she wanted to go back to teaching again. We went to school at Hazelwood School, almost inside of our house. But she couldn't get a job there. She had to get a job all the way across town teaching at East Waynesville School. That was no problem, actually, except that my mother was one of those teachers who thought her day was wasted if she didn't get to school before the janitor did. And she wouldn't dare leave in the afternoon until the principal had gone home. The only problem with that was that she took my brother and myself to school as she went in the morning. Dropped us off, and then she went on across town. In the afternoon, we'd wait till she finally left, and she'd pick us up on the way home. Wasn't so bad up through September and on into this part of October, but along toward Thanksgiving, it got kind of rough. We could see our house almost. And we'd say, why can't we walk home? And she'd say, boys, don't you know anything? It's not safe for children to go home by themselves after school in the afternoon. I thought, well, why is it safe for us to stay down here and freeze to death on the steps of this school? At least we could go home and die where it's warm. Well, finally she began to catch on to this a little bit, because one day she came in and told us she had a plan. She said, listen, boys, when that bell rings today, you go as straight as you can go to Miss Annie McIntosh's house. Miss Annie was our nearest neighbor, and the plan had been made for her to be our after-school babysitter. Once we started going to her house, we went every chance we got. It was a wonderful place to go. A big, sort of ridiculous-looking, kind of Victorian house. It had 2 porches downstairs, and the upstairs one screened in for sleeping in the summer, 5 sides. The roof ran up like pie wedges to a point on top, which had a lightning rod on it with a blue glass ball in the middle, a cable that snaked down off the edge of the roof and fell to a stake in the ground. The roof was tin, but not like at our house. This roof was covered with fancy tin shingles with scalloped edges along the bottoms. The kitchen was just 1 story, and it stuck off to the side at a funny angle. The house was a wonderful place to play. It had 2 sets of stairs, a big curving set of stairs inside the front door that followed the bulge of those odd walls. It had a wonderful banister you could slide down if you stopped before the big post at the bottom. And then a little secret set of stairs with door at the top and bottom that sort of went sneaking down from the back of the hall upstairs to the corner of the kitchen below. 3 people lived there. Miss Annie. She was old. She could have been 50. In reality, she was probably somewhere up in her 70s, maybe 80 or so. And also in reality, she was not Miss, but Mrs. She had been a widow so long, though, that she used her maiden name and everyone called her Miss Annie. Miss Annie had a motto that summarized all of world history. People get what they deserve. She would say, oh, don't get so excited when something good happens. Don't get so excited. That's been coming. Something real sad happened. Oh, don't worry about that. That's been on its way. People get what they deserve. She believed it. My daddy said it didn't suit her. She was what he called a patron saint of lost causes. You see, she was Miss Annie. because her husband, to hear her tell about it, had been killed in the way old McKinley messed up Grover Cleveland's little play war. He had died in Cuba in the Spanish-American War as a young man, leaving her alone with 4 sons and a daughter to raise by herself. And her father, again to hear her tell about it, old Colonel McIntosh, had been killed by a bunch of Kirk's marauders over about Unicoi, Tennessee, in the Northern Aggression. And they had brought him home in a big pine coffin with a Confederate flag on top. But still, she said, people get what they deserve. The second person who lived there was Mary Catherine. Mary Catherine was about 7 years old on the inside. She was probably 40 or so on the outside. If she had been born in a different time, or even in a different place, there would have been a school for her. But being born when and where she was, it was either just Hazelwood School or nothing. Miss Annie had taken her down to school when she was 6 years old, had enrolled her in the first grade some 35 years before that, had walked back to get her every afternoon after school. But on Friday afternoon, when she walked onto the playground and saw Mary Catherine sitting there under a tree, crying her eyes out, while the rest of the first grade girls skipped rope singing, Mary Catherine McIntosh, got no brains, oh my gosh. She never went back to school again. And here, nearly 40 years later, she was still 7 years old, our constant playmate and companion. The third resident of the big house was Rachel. Her full name was Rattling Rachel. She was a gray 1939 Chevrolet with a sharp-pointed, chrome-plated nose and little tail lights that looked like gray torpedoes running backwards. A wonderful car. Rachel had 2 gear shifts. She had come from the factory with a column shift and one of the first vacuum clutches you could get in a Chevrolet. Miss Annie said it burned up. My brother and I crawled all around under that car trying to see where the fire had been. We never could figure that out. The dirt road mechanic who had fixed Rachel had dropped out that whole transmission and matched up one from another Chevy, but this one had a floor shift. So he had to cut a hole in the floorboard, run the gear shift through, cut out a carpet scrap, and slide it down over the gear shift and let it slip around there on the floor to keep the dirt from coming through. And now Rachel had 2 gear shifts. The dead one still there on the steering column and the live one growing up out of the floor. Whenever we went anywhere, Miss Annie drove and I rode in her lap. I could tell when it was time. I could feel her left knee sinking under my bottom as she pushed the clutch in before she ever said it, but she'd say it anyway, shift! And I'd throw mine up into second, and she'd grind hers up into second, let out the clutch, Rachel would jump, and here we go. Wonderful car. Took 2 people to drive it. Well, as soon as we really started going to Miss Annie's house, we just went every time we could. One day when we went to town in Rachel, we stopped at the library and loaded the whole back seat full of books. She said, they're for Mary Catherine. I thought, well, Mary Catherine can't read big old books like that. But we got home and we found out what it was all about. After lunchtime every day, Miss Annie read to Mary Catherine. And we listened first outside the window till she caught us and told us to come on inside. And then we begged for her to wait till after school, or we'd go on Saturdays or Sundays or during the summer and listen to her read. Her favorites were those Thomas Nelson Page adventures, 2 Little Confederates. The one we loved the most, a square, reddish book called Beautiful Joe, about a dog who had been abused by a man named Jenkins, who chopped the dog's ears and tail off until it finally found a home with someone who thought it was beautiful. Kipling's poems, she read and read and read. Sometimes at Miss Annie's house, things would get a little dull, and she'd say, "Come on, boys, let's shoot some Yankees." We'd go back in the bedroom to where she kept the Confederate flag from her father's coffin, folded in the bottom drawer. She'd bring out the flag and thumbtack it to a broomstick. Mary Catherine always got to carry the flag because we might let it touch the ground. And then here we'd go through the pastures and woods and over hills and through fields, shooting at Yankees that had to be behind every rock and every bush and every stump till she had us completely worn out. And then we'd drag back to the house and see who won. The winner was the person who had been wounded the most and lived through it. Wounds. Cockleburs, beggar lice, count them all up. I got hit 27 times. I'm not even bleeding. I won. Mother said, "What did you do at Miss Annie's today?" "We shot Yankees." She'd look at my daddy and say, "That woman is C-R-A-Z-Y." But we'd always go back because she was the only babysitter. When she was not taking care of us, she spent most of her time raising flowers. In the summertime, wildflowers under the hemlock trees, Jack in the pulpit, half-dozen kinds of trillium, wide beds of annuals so that there were always cut flowers to bring in the house, a rose garden but no white roses, the bugs get on them. A long bed of hillside dahlias with blooms so big she had to stake the plants up or the blooms would turn the whole things over. And in the wintertime, when it got cold and she could no longer work outside, she kept growing flowers in the house with needle and thread. Beautiful crewel embroidery, cross-stitch pillow tops and seat cushions and bell pulls. But the thing my brother and I loved to watch her do more than anything else was make what she called her applied work quilt tops. She'd save all the scraps. She especially liked my daddy's old wide neckties when he got tired of them. And she'd cut the scraps into shapes: houses, barns, cows, dogs, horses, haystacks, fences, plowed fields, roads. Hem the edges, make a big solid quilt top, and then lay out the picture there. Stitch it down, and there was a bed all covered with a scene of life the way she thought it ought to be. She gave them all away, but she never gave us one. One day at her house, she said, "Come on, boys, it's a little dull today. Let's shoot down airplanes." A bunch of the neighbors had learned to fly during the Second World War, and they had rented George Plot's hayfield for the Plot Creek Air Base. It was sort of a dog-leggy field, which made taking off and landing real exciting, real interesting. The hangar was a hay barn that had an orange windsock on top. They had 2 J-3 Piper Cubs and a Stearman biplane, all painted the same color out of a bucket of paint they swiped from the highway department, sort of a bright yellow-orange. We went to the front closet, and Miss Annie took out a little .410 shotgun. She kept it there loaded with rat shot, as she said it, to protect us from the roving element. I found out later on that you can't really do a lot of damage from much distance with a .410 full of rat shot. I tried to shoot a squirrel with it. I either knocked it off the limb or scared it off, but before I could get to it and beat it to death the way she told me I'd have to do, it jumped up and ran away. But the gun did make a pretty good noise. We went to the top of a hill, a good 100 yards above the landing strip. And here would come a yellow airplane coming in to land. It would come in, and just as the wheels would touch the ground, she'd say, "Fire!" We'd pull the trigger, and the shotgun would go blam, and the airplane would stop. And she'd say, "You got it." We lined up little rows of sticks to show how many planes we'd shot down. We were so successful, it got kind of boring after a while. I said, "Miss Annie, I'd like to shoot one down when it's taking off." She said, "Oh, they're hard to hit when they're taking off. But you can try." Loaded up the shotgun. Here, one of the yellow Piper Cubs went out of sight at the other end of the field. We could hear the engine run up, and then here it came, the tail already off the ground. Most of the way down the field, it left the ground about 10 feet in the air. She said, "Fire!" I pulled the trigger. The shotgun went blam! And the Piper Cub went. And the wooden propeller just kind of jumped back and went, boom. And the whole world turned into a slow-motion movie as that yellow airplane settled down to the ground and bounced. And then it bounced, and it couldn't bounce again because the hayfield ran out. And the wheels caught on the hedge, and the tail started coming slowly up in the air, and it came all the way over, and the whole yellow airplane squashed right on its top in my daddy's corn. I looked at Miss Annie, and she looked pale. She grabbed us, and we started toward the airplane. The doors opened. Dan Watkins popped out one side, Perry Plemons out the other side. When she saw that they were okay, we stopped, and she said, "You got it." And we went home. That day, when it was time to go back to our house, Mary Catherine walked with us. My mother was already waiting by the door, and she said, "Oh, you know what happened today? One of those crazy airplanes cut off, da-da-da." I said, "We know all about what happened. Miss Annie and I shot it down." She looked at my daddy and said, "That woman is C-R-A." My daddy said, "Oh, don't say that in front of Mary Catherine." She said, "Oh, she's never been to school. She can't read or write or read. She doesn't know what that means." But she did go home pretty fast after that. We never fought at Miss Annie's house, but once. One day, my brother and I tried to have a little fight. It didn't last very long. We got it over with in maybe 5 or 10 minutes, but we didn't get it over with fast enough. She walked in on us. She said, "You're fighting." "No, we're finished." "No, you're not. You're fighting." "No, we're finished." "No, you're fighting. You want to find out what fighting's about? Today is the day. We will find out today what fighting is about." "Hit him back, Joe." "I can't even see where you hit him." "Hit him till I can see it turn red where you hit him. And if you can't do it with a fist, open up and slap." "There, that's good. I can see all 5 fingers. Now hit him back. It's your turn. I want to see it. Now pull hair, and I better see hair come out in your fingers, and your heads turn red where it comes from. Now scratch, boys. Scratch at the same time. Now it's time to bite, and if I can't see the tooth marks in 2 or 3 days from now, you'll have to bite again." And there she stood and made us fight. All the time standing there with tears just pouring down her face, saying, "If old McKinley had only known what happens when people really fight, maybe things wouldn't have turned out the way they did." If we wanted to fight after that, we'd do it at home where it was safe. I mean, my mom would come in and give us a pop, make us quit in a minute about the time we wanted it over with. We weren't about to go into that business again. One day she put us to bed in the big room. It was pouring rain. The rain was pelting on the tin roof of the house. It was so loud that we couldn't hear where she might be. So we opened the window shade to watch it rain for a while. And when we looked out the window, we saw where she was. She was out in the rain, walking around, no umbrella, no raincoat. A blue print flowery cotton dress just glued to her all up and down. Her hair, which was always piled high and full of combs of every kind, beginning to come loose, and as she became more and more soaked, she pulled the combs out, and the hair washed down and streamed down in the front and the back. She sat down in a wooden chair in the yard and leaned back and just let the rain run all down. My brother said, "Look at her face. Is she crying?" I said, "You can't tell, can you?" We didn't tell her mother about that, because we thought, if she does that, she really might be. And we might not get to come back anymore. Well, gradually we grew up and didn't need a babysitter much anymore. At the same time, Miss Annie got older. And everybody would say, "What's going to happen to poor Mary Catherine once Miss Annie's gone?" Never realizing that Mary Catherine was gradually becoming the mother. One day, Rattling Rachel died. Miss Annie called my mother to tell about it. Said she was just fine yesterday. We went to town. We went to the drugstore. We went all over the place. She was just fine when I put her to bed in the garage last night. But when I went out there this morning, turned the key, stepped on the starter, she had died in the night. I don't know if it was her heart or her liver or whatever it was. But I guess she's run long enough, and I guess maybe I've driven long enough. And she washed the old car right there in the garage, swept it out, covered it with clean sheets, locked the garage door with a chain and padlock, put the keys in an envelope on the mantel, which she had written her oldest grandson's name on the outside of, saying someday he'll probably want to bring her back to life. And from that day on, my mother became her chauffeur. She'd call up and say, "I need to go to the doctor." And we'd pile in our blue car, bounce up Rattling Rachel's old road, and load up Miss Annie and Mary Catherine, just like old times. We'd go to the doctor's office and then come out, and she'd say, "Need to go by the library." And we'd go by, haul in armloads of books and bring out more books. Need to run by the drugstore for a minute. We'd go to Smith's drugstore, which always took a little while, and then need to run by the church just for a little while. We'd go by there, and then by the circle chairman's house, and then by the president of the DAR's house, and then the secretary of the UDC's house, and then finally to Josephine's dress shop, and then stop at the grocery store. And by the time we finally got home, we'd be mostly out of gas and way after dark. And my mother would be mad. She hadn't even started to fix supper for us yet. But my daddy would say, "Now you have to calm down. You have to calm down. You have to take her places, because she helped us raise the boys." And we took her places forever. Gradually, the wildflowers got wilder because no one could mow the yard. They didn't care. They just sort of eased their way on up toward the house and were prettier and prettier every year. Miss Annie didn't die all at once. She just sort of quit working one part at a time. First, her legs quit, and she couldn't go outside and raise the flowers anymore. That didn't seem to make much difference to the great outdoors. But she kept raising flowers inside until finally her eyes began to quit. She would try to work through a big magnifying glass with a bright light, but we could tell that she couldn't see because both her fingers and the needlework came out all bloody. But still, she tried. Sometimes my brother and I would go, and now we would read to her Kipling's poems and Beautiful Joe and even Two Little Confederates once in a while. Gradually her hands and eyes gave out, and finally when she was 97 years old, her heart stopped. People were very surprised that Mary Catherine could take care of herself very well. She called us a couple of days after the funeral and said, "Come on up here. There's something Mama said I was supposed to give you if she ever died." And we got in the car and started back up that old road to the big house. All washed out now, rocky, we bumped up, walked up the sidewalk, no yard left, the flowers grown over everywhere, up sort of crumbling concrete steps. My daddy said, "Watch your step here on the porch, it's kind of rotten." We never realized how much the house needed painting by now. Mary Catherine came to the door and took us into a big dining room. There was a huge oval table there, and over it was a light fixture that always had 7 bulbs in it. Miss Annie kept 6 of them unscrewed. But on this day, Mary Catherine stood on a chair and screwed them all in, turned on the switch, and the room was brighter than we'd ever seen it before. She disappeared into the bedroom. We could see her rummaging in the bottom of the chest of drawers. My brother and I knew that's where the Confederate flag stayed. We thought, maybe we're going to get that. We always kind of wanted that. But she pushed it aside and took out a huge package wrapped in brown paper. Brought it back to the dining room table and began to unwrap there the biggest applied work quilt we had ever seen. Mountains in the background. A big white ridiculous-looking Victorian house in the middle. Complete to a pointed roof with a lightning rod and a blue glass ball on the top. A girl on the front porch holding a stick with a Confederate flag. Flowers everywhere on the sides of the yard. An old gray car in the driveway. A yellow airplane overhead. 2 little boys running through the yard. Between them an old woman, hair piled high on her head, with her arms reached out, not holding, but just barely touching the tops of their heads. And at the bottom of it all, in big block letters, the words, "My boys." My mother began to cry. She said, "Why did she do it? And how did she do it with those when she couldn't even see?" My daddy tried to save the day. He always did. And he said, "Oh, you know why she did it. Now just think about it. Why, you took her everywhere. You drove her all around town. And like she says, people get what they deserve. That's why she did it. Isn't that right, Mary Catherine?" Mary Catherine said, "No. She did it because she was C-R-A-Z-Y."